Welcome to Parallax.
Welcome to the Parallax podcast. I'm your host, Thomas Mark. With me today is Alexander Barth. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me, Tom.
Yes, we wanted to talk a little bit about war today. The question, how much of it, of our culture is due to war, if it's something that we can overcome, something that we are able to overcome. And so in your last big book, Process and Event, you mentioned war at least 150 times. You talk a lot about war in context of nomadology, right? And so the question now is, how do we can understand war from, the point of view of nomadology, the sociont, the original ideas of the warrior and his relationship to the chieftain and the priest, and what does it mean for us today, right? And so the question, just to begin with, so just illuminate us a little bit about nomadology and the role of the warrior in context of the original tribe.
I think we have to start with the fact that we've lived in a long, long period of peace historically, which is totally unique. And we're sort of detached from this idea that almost war sounds like an absurdity. And still we were reminded in the 1990s with the civil war in Yugoslavia that Europe can still go to war. And we were reminded of it again now with Ukraine versus Russia. And we got the Middle East. And suddenly everybody's sort of aware of the fact the Cold War is back. This time it isn't Russia versus America. This time it's China versus America. And we got the nuclear bomb. And we know that if the Iranians get the nuclear bomb, they could blow us all up. It's war all over again. But we are so detached from it that it could be nice to start by going into the worlds of history and anthropology to try to understand war. For me, the wake-up call was when I was in New Guinea, or Papua. It's called Papua. The whole island is called Papua these days. This was Western Papua, the part that Indonesia occupies at the moment. And I was in southern Papua. And of course, I was doing what anthropologists do. I was living with several different tribes, and they're very friendly to me. But, I also, for the first time in my life, saw actual warfare, like something you would do as a sport. I think it was something more like a Sunday afternoon. I don't remember what the calendar was like in Papua, to be honest about it. And these guys were fighting with weapons, and some guys died. And some of the guys were seriously wounded. And I realized that, okay, this is gladiators. That's a kind of terminology to use. But it was contemporary with myself. It was just a different world altogether. And then I realized that war originally was something that happened constantly. We were in constant warfare. But as long as we were nomadic, it was fighting another nomadic tribe at a time. So basically, if you were a tribe and you were constantly on the move, trying to find shelter, food, drink, whatever, to keep the whole thing going, stay alive, you had to move constantly. This is where our term nomadology comes from. It's originally from Gilles Deleuze, but we're using it too as a kind of idea of an ur-religion, of a kind of an ur-society that we lived in for hundreds of thousands, possibly millions of years. We're constantly nomadic. So we would probably be on our own in our tribe while we walked and tried to find food and shelter until we run into another tribe. And it was very, very likely that another tribe weren't even human to us. We would try to kill them as quickly as we could. It was basically men killing men, trying to protect the women and the children. And this is like in a fundamental sense what the concept of war is. So it's survival, it is territorial, it is the struggle over food and shelter, and one tribe wins and one tribe goes down, and the tribe that wins is the one that replicates itself. So there was never a selfish gene, there was a selfish tribe. This is where Dawkins need to be corrected. But if you look at the evolution of humanity, then eventually the sociont came along as a form, which is like the perfect sized tribe to try to win as many wars as possible to survive. So this was a constant, right? What then happens is that as we go semi-nomadic and create ritual places and populations start to grow, we need to start communicating with foreign tribes in a different way than warfare. And this is what I consider the birth of religion. So to be a priest is essentially to pragmatically realize that war will probably arrive sooner or later. But if you could just keep the war away for a little longer, if we just keep the peace between two tribes going a little longer, we could communicate better between the tribes without killing each other. If we could maybe take their sons and our daughters and marry them and create a sense of a larger tribe than tribe, then we could keep the whole machinery going without killing each other. So we could start avoiding the bloodbaths. And this is also in history when things like the blood sacrifice begin to be questioned. On this, René Girard is dead wrong. It wasn't Christianity that stopped blood sacrifices. It was actually Zoroastrianism in Persia 4,000 years ago that came up with the idea that there's no point in sacrificing blood because blood sacrifice is ultimately what war is. We sacrifice the young men on a battlefield to win. And that's the point with war. So the whole idea is that can we then keep peace going longer, although we know that at least within men and in a supportive role within women and within sexuality, we love war. We just don't love its consequences.
Right.
So this is what I would call the nomadology of war. This is a nomadological perspective looking at warfare.
Right. So you mentioned Deleuze and Guattari, and they wrote a book about nomadology, I think, in the 70s, 80s or something. And they talked about, the internal relation between the chieftain and the priest, which form like an interiority for the state, basically, and the warrior who is in their conception always outside, like hated by the state figures as Achilles was hated by Agamemnon. But it was the warrior who invented as a nomad, and as a walker between the tribes, he invented basically in their conception war, right?
Well, I would stretch it further. The book is brilliant, by the way. It's a tiny little book called Nomadology. It came out in the 1980s. And Deleuze was very sick at the time. He only lived for a few more years before he just called it quits. But it's a brilliant little book, and it's a brilliant term. What we did with Nomadology, as you do as well. You just recently done it in your latest book, Phenomenology, with Schopenhauer and with Sloterdijk. You take these heroes and you extend them. You know that there are things they hadn't thought about or things they had not discussed, so therefore you can take their spirit with you and you can go further. So if you take the spirit of Deleuze with us, we go into nomadology. For us, looking for a history prior to history, which is the genetic history of human beings. So it's not the verbal history and it's not the written history. This is the genetic history that we all inherit, which is how we biologically, evolutionarily developed over millions of years and became the humans we are today. And therefore, we have to consider the pathos. We have to consider the forces inside of us. We have to consider the frustrations inside of us. We have to take our sexuality. We have to take violence into our philosophy, into our perspective, what it means to be human. Because if we try to hide those things, we will blow ourselves up. We create pressure cookers everywhere in contemporary society. And these pressure cookers have to be released somewhere, or else we will go into a really violent period in history and everything will be blown up. So let's see if we can be priestly here in the sense that can we maintain the peace a little longer for a few more territories and then we succeeded. So this is the goal of being a priest or being goal of being religion. And this is part of Deleuze and Guattari's work too. But what they're doing is that they're looking at the warrior as this outsider where they're mixing him up with the shaman. So they're not really having, they don't have a clear delineation between the shaman and the warrior, although they're related. Prometheus in this sense is the hero both of the warrior and is also shaman at the same time. So the shamanic warrior is this really inventive warrior who conquers new territories, who expands the territory and things like that. And of course, Deleuze and Guattari are sitting there jerking off to these ideas. They're men, and they gladly admit it. They're best friends with Foucault. There you go. They're Nietzscheans. But I would say in this sense that what is lacking is to take the warrior archetype into contemporary society and realize we've actually also succeeded in taming the warrior into something else. And the name for that character is the engineer. Elon Musk, hello. So we have engineers and they build everything. Like Camille Paglia says as a woman, every day I drive across the Brooklyn Bridge, I'm grateful there are men out there, because without men, there wouldn't be any skyscrapers, there wouldn't be any buildings, there wouldn't be any bridges, there wouldn't be any roads, there wouldn't be anything. Because everything ever was built by men, designed by men, built by men. And this is how the world works. That's what men do. And that's because we tamed the warrior when the warrior started building forts to defend himself and he had to control himself for long periods of time when it was peace, to then be ready to go to battle when war finally arrived, he built forts. And by building forts, by building protection for women and children and for other men, by building the protection, you are a warrior / engineer. And this is why in my work, I study engineers and I sit with engineering teams and study them intensely. I'm very fascinated with them, how their brains operate, what makes them creative, and how they tear things apart and pull them together again and improve on things constantly. This protopian idea of the engineer, somebody improves on the quality of things. So they're right in that the warrior is the inventor, but the name for the warrior as inventor in contemporary society is the engineer.
Right. Okay. So you mentioned pressure cookers because that's a psychological and a social problem, because obviously when we're talking about eras or epochs or paradigms, we're coming to the modernity basically with secularism, with humanism, with enlightenment. And we know that's basically one of the most violent epochs that we had, in the last century. And then it's like even now coming in the so-called postmodern age, or even the Green Party in Germany, famously founded as an anti-war party, as in a reaction towards the Second World War, now openly wants Germany to be fit for war and calls for war. So there's like a weird kind of thing happening where this warrior type, this engineer type, is not properly integrated, and the pressure cooker can only cook for so long till it bursts.
Welcome to Parallax, the resurrection of truth, beauty, and goodness. Parallax, a media war engine. Parallax, the construction amidst eternal decay. Parallax, the portal to the edge of chaos. Parallax, poem and provocation. Parallax, mad philosophers and tantric demigods. Parallax, totem for an unknown god. Parallax, philosophy and the return of the matriarch. Parallax, the end of the meaning crisis. Parallax, the whispering daemon in your ear. Parallax, the god of wisdom, wine and love. Parallax, your home for superior publications, podcasts and courses. Parallax, join us today.
Right.
True, and I would argue here you can't facilitate the warrior in that sense, because I don't believe there are any pacifists at all. Pacifism for me is just a fake strategy applied by people when it suits their interests. So if the Greens got ahead in German politics by being pacifists, they were pacifists. And then suddenly they realized that, no, we got to be with Ukraine against Russia and defend civilization. And we have all, every reason in the world, because environmentalism now needs war, because otherwise environmentalism cannot happen. And that's our ideology. So suddenly we're going to be war environmentalists, right? So pacifism, just like vegetarianism, is just opposed to be. Because vegetarianism to me is just being opposed to the hunter, which is opposed to one phallus. And then the other phallus is the warrior. So being opposed to the warrior is pacifism. These are just very superficial stances that people quickly and easily drop if they have to. Now, if you don't have anything else but steak to eat, vegetarians will start eating steak in a second and they will love it. So in that sense, I think it's better to compare violence to sexuality, in that we realized after Freud that sexuality cannot be contained. Sexuality is never harmonious. Sexuality is never balanced. It just needs to be discussed and talked about and be allowed to be in some kind of a dialectical deadlock where it has no solution. And I think we have to look at violence exactly the same way. Byung-Chul Han, the Korean Seon philosopher, Korean Zen philosopher, has written a lot about how violence is contained, and if we create a pacifist society where violence is not allowed to be expressed anywhere, the violence is just accumulated somewhere else because it's a constant, just like sexuality, and therefore violence becomes a huge superego. It becomes the violence against yourself as a citizen of that type of society, which I would say we see in young men everywhere in our society today. We see that sort of enormous, strong superego. You're not good enough, and they go to the gym and they go fighting and they do everything they can to improve on themselves and work on themselves to impress somebody out there who isn't even there. And that's because that superego injunction is so hard on them. So the violence is a constant. It's constantly there and must be dealt with. Now, the question is, can we find these paths, these flights use the lesson language, these flights out of the pressure cooker, these flights where we can let the pressure out. And one example is, for example, engineering under capitalism, when we created corporations that fought each other in the marketplace, and engineers and salesmen, who are the hunters of corporations, fought each other. Salesmen especially like to fight each other all the time. They fight over who did the best deal and who made the most money. That's the motivator, right? So by putting them into competition with each other, we created a fantastic mechanism called capitalism, which does what? It releases the pressure from the pressure cooker of violence, because it releases the violence into something productive and creative, which is create better services and better products that we can sell in the market. Until, of course, that is exhausted and the customers out there said, we have enough products, we have enough services, we're looking for something else entirely, because we don't, there's no spirituality to consumerism, for example. And that's when that happens, when spirituality comes back into the equation and we start questioning the consumerism of capitalism, then we can no longer trust that having men competing as hunters and warriors within corporations rather than as countries fighting each other war, we can't trust that will work any longer, because that skepticism, that proper spiritual skepticism, will eat itself into the souls of the men too. And they will start thinking, well, maybe making tons of money working for a company after all is not what I'm looking for. And they sense something much more aggressive and violent beneath that needs to get out. Then we have sports. Perfect example. We have martial arts, we have team sports. I mean, the reason why football is the most popular sport ever is because it's simple, it can go global, but it's a team of 11 men, the perfect hunting team, who go out and hunt together. And they have a coach who's watching them and is also directing them where they should go, which is the priest. And they have a king who's like the ultimate football player. He's the forward, he's the goal, he's the guy who scores all the goals. And at the other end of him, you got the goalkeeper. So you have these sort of archetypes of a hunting team on a field chasing a ball against another team, which again is like what I saw in Papa on Sundays, except in Papa, people were literally killed, and the football field, they're hopefully not killed. But by being a hooligan in a soccer game, you realize what an enormous release of violence and aggression that comes out of that experience. And you realize how close that is to warfare. And again, we have in civilization tried to create these different places, these different spheres, to speak Sloterdijk, where we can release the pressure from the pressure cooker of violence. And we have to take into account as well that women are very much a part of this. Like I always said, when women try to play pacifist, I'm just saying, oh, so your husband isn't good enough in bed any longer, you plan to remarry somebody else. Listen, every time war started, there were always women crying, when the train left and the soldiers went to the front. Oh, they were crying out of joy and pride because their boyfriends and their husbands were going to war. Whereas it took them like 3 months to start looking for another husband if the husband didn't return with the trophy. So women are very much a part of the violence, because otherwise men would not be as addicted to violence as they are. So it's part of the game, and violence is the twin of sexuality.
Right. I mean, the question that arises for me is that war obviously is, at least up to now, very much a constant in our life. That seems to be an expression of, let's say, chaos per se. When we use this metaphor, then peace is like the more order and stability in society, and then we have chaos, more moments of the eruption of order, where strangely, sometimes very good things happen afterwards. I mean, I said this in another time and space, the Frankfurt School and lots of big chunks of philosophy and systems theory and all these cultural developments that emerged as a reaction to the Second World War. And the problem is, of course, I mean, we don't like to think about war and these things, because war in itself is so dehumanizing, and we all imagine an utopian kind of world without war. But the reality seems to be that there's an inherent function attached to war and for evolution. And so you mentioned soccer. I mean, we're playing soccer for so long now. Can that really, be a placeholder for war, or do we need to develop a different kind of approach to chaos itself and to the creative forces that come out of chaos?
I'm really serious here. I think where Deleuze and you and I might agree is that we can temporarily create that placeholder, but it's not permanent. It's not a permanent solution. We don't have a permanent solution to this urge towards war. We don't have that. We can only create the containers. This is why priesthood is essentially incredibly pragmatic. Is that as soon as you start working with people and their problems, anybody who's done social work will discover very quickly you can only do what you can do. If you're dealing with psychiatric disease, sometimes people are just so damn sick they will go and kill themselves, and you can't stop them from doing it because they have such terror inside their heads, some unimaginable terror inside the house, that you would do the same if you were them. And you just have to accept this sort of a pragmatic approach. And whenever priests start working, get out of the theory booth and start working with people directly, they become intensely pragmatic. And I think the only way to deal with this urge towards war is to, number one, deal with it pragmatically, and number two, be brutally honest about it. I definitely subscribe to the sort of Hegelian, Freudian, Nietzschean approach towards these forces. That these are forces that ultimately are life and death, and they have to be there. And I just give you a perfect example of the honesty we have to deal with here, is that if a society is completely wiped out due to a war, then somebody will populate that territory sooner or later, and they will rebuild, or rather build, a new civilization. And it will probably be fresher than anything else. I mean, if you go to war-torn areas and you discover 40, 50 years later where all the fancy new buildings were built 30 years ago after the war, they were all built in the old war zones. Whereas the places that escaped the war might look idyllic, but they will look very old, very dated, very scrappy. Nobody ever rebuilt anything. So it's like if you look at Europe today, the problem with Europe today is that, for example, if you build a new wind power or solar power park on the North Sea, and you want to transport electricity generated to the factories in Bavaria, where that electricity is desperately needed, you need thousands and thousands of permits on the way, because peace creates bureaucracy. Peace creates enormous bureaucracies, and they just go bigger and bigger and bigger until war comes along and destroys them. And then we rebirth society by rebuilding it. And we don't have another way of rebuilding a society, except for total natural disasters, which is another form of war. It's basically war, waging war against us, which is like an earthquake or a tsunami or something like that. But unless you have massive natural disasters, war is the only thing that eradicates an old civilization and forces us humans to rebuild something new on top of it. And this, I think, is deeply problematic, because we have to leave room somewhere for the novel. And this is why Deleuze and Guattari went all the way into the nomadological mindset and the warrior's mindset and all that, because they already in the 1980s were prophetic in that they sensed that the sort of postmodern European American culture they were part of was going towards this stasis, this static state where nothing new could happen, when there was this animosity towards the novel. And to them, that looked more like an Indian caste system than it looked like anything that they wanted to propose or defend. And I buy that. I think Deleuze and Foucault, being the Nietzscheans, they broke with the Marxists in France and said Marxism will also, only Nietzsche discusses forces as such. We have to go back to Nietzsche, right? So Deleuze and Foucault do that, and you and I are both inheritors of them in turn, right? We're kind of the sons of Deleuze and Foucault in our work. And I think it's essential to understand that the urge towards war, or the will to war, is constantly there. It has to be questioned. We have to be enlightened about it. We cannot hide it. It has to be problematized in philosophy. It has to be dealt with. And Sloterdijk deals with it. Zizek deals with it. You know, all the serious philosophers do deal with it. They don't try to hide it. None of them is a pacifist, and none of them is a vegetarian. Let's put it that way.
Right. So you mentioned, interestingly, psychopathic patient. This is an interesting thing because nobody is all the time psychopathic. Nobody is all the time neurotic. And so it's, of course, because people have episodes or fits. So it builds up. And this, of course, leads to libido, you know? And so it's like, what is the right thing to think about libido and neuroses or psychopathy in that context? Because what we're seeing when we're looking at war is, of course, a society that kind of resembles a psyche in conflict with itself, right? Like a society in a psychopathic fit, let's say, or episode. And you say, okay, so that's normal kind of way. So what's the right way of thinking about this? Not to pathologize it, but to what is the dynamic behind this?
Well, I'm a great proponent of libido. That's why I converted to Zoroastrianism. I think Mortido is death. Maybe it's not for women, but certainly for me as a man. And the libido is, the peak libido is always a dialectical relationship between the neurosis and the psychosis. Because if you fall into psychosis, you cannot express the libido in any way whatsoever. You lose your subjectivity. And if you fall into neurosis, you get stuck with something, repeated constantly, which is also mortidinal. So the way to get away from mortido into the libido is actually to be right in between, in this sort of dialectical position between the neurosis and the psychosis, where you always laugh at yourself because you have a neurotic side, you have another psychotic side to yourself. And sexuality is the perfect example of that. It's this urge between man and woman, for example, in exchanging each other's neurosis and psychosis. Like women always present the neurosis to you, so you can go psychotic with her there, and then you present your neurosis to her, and she can go psychotic with that, and that's exactly what sexual intercourse does. And then we're relaxed after the sexual intercourse. We're sort of relieved. And bitches are probably relieved after you've done war. It's like, okay, we're exhausted now. We've done war, like on a massive scale. Two cultures fucked each other. And now we find, and our young men died, and tragedy arrived, and, you know, and all the creativity comes out of that too. We can acknowledge that too. So it's very similar in that sense. Except that we assume, at least, that fucking and going to war are very similar, but at war we die. And at fucking, we almost die. It's called an orgasm, but then we can step back and we still survive, and we can actually breed. But they are similar. The little death is there, and in a way, fucking is the little war, in that sense. So violence, sexuality are certainly related. So I'd say libido. I would say libido. A healthy libido knows what it is, and it loves what it is, and it's in that mode, and it wants to conquer the world, and it wants to fuck. It's horny, and it's creative, and it wants to create the novel. It takes responsibility for the process to occur. It takes responsibility for repetition to occur. You got to put food on the table every day. You got to go to sleep every night. All those things that are process take responsibility. But whatever energy you got left, whatever time you got left once you delivered on the process, you can allow for the event, for experimentation, for the novel. And this is deeply, deeply libidinal. And I'm a strong defender of it. My philosophy is deeply Nietzschean, affirmative, in the sense that I love libido in this sense. What then happens is that with psychiatric diseases, that these things don't fall into place, or they seem to fall into place, but do so in a deranged way. And the communication breaks down with the outside world. And that's what you either experience, and then you have hell inside your head, or you don't experience inside your head, and then become a psychopath. You cause havoc on other people. You don't even realize that's not what you do. So psychiatric disease, in this sense, is this tweaked libido, which no longer has a straight line to where it's going. It no longer has a goal to where it's heading. It no longer has an exodology. And that's the psychiatrically diseased form of libido.
Right. And so you also mentioned in Process in the Event the relationship between paradigm shifts and war, right? And so the question, of course, is, do we need war for paradigm shifts, or are paradigm shifts possible without war, or even proxy wars? So
I think the bloodiness of paradigm shifts has historically always occurred. We should assume it would occur again. We should assume that a lot of the warfare going on at the moment is like that. To me, Ukraine versus Russia is a paradigmatic war, but it's the previous paradigm shift being replayed to us. The Ukrainians have chosen no longer to beat their children. That's how all my Ukrainian friends describe themselves as Ukrainian to me. We're not Russians. We don't beat our kids. What they mean is that they're pro-democracy, they're pro-liberalism, They're pro-multicultural. They're pro-urban culture rather than the rural one. They're anti-feudalism. They're pro-transparency. They want to know everything. They should have many news channels to watch every day. And the Ukrainians celebrate this. And this has now become the Ukrainian identity. The Ukrainian identity has become the ultimate European Enlightenment identity. And they know it's an old paradigm. But compared to what they're fighting, which is Putinism, which is feudal, that's what they're going up against. So for me, the Ukraine-Russia war, as it states right now, is a reminder of a paradigmatic war. And here's the problem with the war. The problem is that when everything else is equal, Russia sends a lot of young men to the battlefield and have thousands of them slaughtered every day. And then people say, well, doesn't Russia have a demography problem? Why is it sacrificing hundreds of thousands of its own citizens on the battlefield? Well, it's sacrificing young men. It's not sacrificing its demography. It's not sacrificing its women and children. It just leaves more women for every man in Russia. It just means that you're going towards polygamy in Russia, where each Russian man who got away from the war and survived or escaped it can marry 4 women and breed with all of them. So over the long term, Russia's population will not decrease, even if it sacrifices hundreds of thousands of young men on the battlefield, because the way war works is that you fool young men onto a battlefield by promising them a star or a key to heaven or some other noble title they'll get because they die in the battlefield. So they walk out on the battlefield and they die, and they get the medal, which will cost the powers that be nothing. They just give you a medal. They might in Russia also have to pay your mother these days. They have to pay the mother a sum of money as well, because otherwise it'd be too obvious, right? So they try to bribe Russian women to sacrifice problematic 90-year-old sons and send these sons to the battlefield, and then they basically be thrown into a meat grinder. But the problem is that to a certain extent, this strategy works. And if there isn't a standstill between Russia and Ukraine, it's because Russia has actually gained territory the last 12 months. And the Ukrainians are devastated because it exposes the weakness, interesting enough, of the European Enlightenment liberal democratic paradigm, because that paradigm is weaker at war because it will not sacrifice its young sons. In Italy, in France, in Britain, in Germany, in Sweden, we would know in an instant if young men died on the battlefield. And even Americans do the same thing. So what we've done in America and Western Europe is that we try to replace young men with more weapons. And the weapon factories churn out more and more weapons, as if the weapons could fight the war instead of young men. And so the sort of the digital age answer to the industrial age dilemma of the feudal age having an advantage in the war between Russia and Ukraine is to create more drones or more weapons that could kill even more Russian young soldiers, because Ukraine does not have the young men that it can willingly sacrifice on the battlefield to win the war. This is a perfect example of 3 paradigms colliding.
Right, but you mentioned that it's a repetition of an older paradigm, let's say called the Enlightenment paradigm, the secularism paradigm that is at war with with Russian feudalism. Is that how you think that the future will be? That so that we globally can at peace, there will be smaller scale, geographically smaller scale wars. So like proxy wars, or will there be in context of new paradigm shifts, like in terms of the autocracy, will there be like bigger wars? Like what's your prognosis on this?
Well, I'd put as many of these young, violent men into the corporate sector as possible and give them careers to begin with. More sports, whatever has worked in the past, have more of it to begin with, right? But when it comes to defending your territory, I live in Sweden. We're now becoming part of a Nordic-Baltic union within NATO. We no longer can trust the Americans. We have to make do with the Poles and the Germans and the French and the Britons, and we have to deal with the other Europeans, and we have to defend a large chunk of territory bordering Russia and Northern Europe. And it's not just defending ourselves against Putin, it's also defending ourselves against what might replace Putin in case he dies, which could be 10 times worse. We don't know. So we have to rethink, and a couple of the guys that work at the monastery are actually becoming officers of the Swedish army, because we have to rethink what would it be to defend a physical territory, which sounds incredibly feudal, doesn't it? But that's what it is. At the bottom, it's defending a physical territory from invasion. What does it mean to defend a physical territory in the digital age? What will it require? Will it require manpower? Will it require that some guys sacrifice their own lives and under a flag get burned because of it? Will anybody be willing to do that? Those questions have to be addressed. We can no longer disguise them. And I think it's precisely by going deep down into our psyche, it's precisely by going into our male souls and rediscovering the warrior and the hunter inside of us, which these guys, the warrior and the hunter, can only really be free if they really are warriors and hunters. And hunters, we have a lot in Sweden. You can get your hunting license, go out and kill animals. And, we need to kill there's a lot of boar out there in the forest right now that needs to be killed. So you can be a hunter in Sweden anytime you like, and a lot of Swedish men are, but they're not warriors to the same extent because Sweden hasn't been at war for 200 years. But we might have to go into war, and we might have to defend our new allies, Finland and Latvia and Estonia, the first thing we do. The new Swedish defense line is Finland, Latvia, Estonia against the East. And the guys I'm working with in the monastery, they're certainly considering becoming officers in the Swedish army. But what they're taking with them is this anthropological perspective, historical perspective of warfare. Like, what would it mean to really conduct warfare in the digital age? What could that be like? Could it even be that two powers got up against each other and a sensocratic calculation tells them that if you two guys push these respective buttons, this side wins and this is the cost for both of you. So don't do it. Just allow the guy who would have won to win anyway, but with far lower costs for both sides. I mean, that would be the AIP solution in a way, wouldn't it? Right? And those solutions are possible, but we're not getting rid of the fundamental existential question for men, which is, why do men want to go to war, and why do they want to die for a cause? And what does that mean today?
Yes. Okay. Let's elaborate a little bit on that. On AI and the role of future AI for wars. On one side, on the second side, our need to go deeper into the psyche to, integrate these roles, these warrior and chieftain kinds of roles and priest. And on the other side, this chaotic element. And the third side, the need for people to sacrifice and to sacrifice themselves. Because a sacrifice, you could make the case, is only worth something if it's meant and if it's done. And so it's such a deep codex of behavior, that we're carrying with us for millions of years, thousands of years. So how do we get rid of, the sacrificial idea?
Or maybe it just needs another role. I mean, you and I are going to work a lot with esotericism over this next year. My next book is called Sufism, working title, and we're going to explore this together, Parallax, you and me and Andrew. It's going to be fantastic. But there, for example, you have fana, you have annihilation, or nirvana in Buddhism, right? And annihilation is another form of self-sacrifice. It's getting rid of the self to go into something, be part of something greater than yourself. So that urge seems to be really, really deep. But of course, in esotericism, it's done within a container and you don't hurt the outside world. And it's a spiritual experience rather than an existential experience, right? So there are many ways in which you want to be part of something bigger, a larger whole than we are. I mean, it's the drive towards the socion to begin with, to be part of the tribe itself. The tribe is much more important than we are. And if we think we're more important than our own tribe, we are completely lost in what I would call the contemporary narcissism, with all the deviations that go with that and all the frustrations that go with that, etc. So that's a no-brainer. We can't go there. So that's a big topic in itself. We can go into that later this year because we're going to discuss the esoteric and the exoteric. And this is, for example, why sacrifice yourself in the field is very spiritual, in the same sense that annihilation in the sort of the Sufi or the Zen experience,
right,
are also sort of self-sacrifice, right? So that's fine there. But if you go to the other two, the great or the terrible thing with AI is that so much of what human beings have done has been guesswork until now.
Has been what? I didn't get
guesswork.
that.
Guesswork.
Guesswork.
Like you're guessing because you don't know. So a large part of warfare. I mean, when I did the military service, I was hardly even in the battlefield. Look, I'm just the skinny little race walking guy. They sent me straight to the strategy room. So I'm a theorist for real. I mean, when it comes to the practice of war, you need theorists. They're called strategy guys. And I was in the strategy room from day one. It worked wonderfully for me. That's where I could serve the army. And that's where I would have died if somebody had blown up a bomb or whatever. But the strategy there was always built on the idea that we put out smoke screens to the enemy, and the less the enemy knows about us, the better. That's exactly why the enemy sent scouts out or spies to find. Like I say, a scout is a straight spy, and a spy is a gay scout, whatever. The scouts and spies are sent everywhere to accumulate information about the enemy. The more you know about the enemy, the better off you are. And it all started with Napoleon. The modern spying and scouting structure started with Napoleon because his soldiers could read and write. So Napoleon was superior. So we have a Napoleonic structure for spying and scouting in the army. And then we put out smoke screens to the enemy. That's becoming fiendishly hard because the enemy knows more about us than he ever did. And we know more about the enemy than we ever did before. And with this sensocracy coming, with data being collected everywhere in the world, I mean, South Korea can pretend that nobody's supposed to know where the roads in South Korea are. You try Google Maps of South Korea and you can't use it because Google are forbidden to do Google Maps of South Korea, as if the North Koreans
North Korea.
did.
You mean North Korea, right?
No, South Korea. South Korea has that.
Oh, mhm.
So as if the North Koreans wouldn't know every road in South Korea
Right.
anyway. Of course they would. So because everybody has the data. You can walk through any customs anywhere in the world. You come to the passport control. You still probably hold the passport in your hand. It's ridiculous. Your iris, your eye is now registered by every government in the world, and anywhere you walk in the world will know who you are forever, and they will know where you've been. So the sensocracy is coming, and because sensocracy is coming with AI, and we have data collection everywhere, and we process the data from everywhere, we know more about the enemy, and the enemy knows more about us. So war can no longer be about putting smoke screens out there and then putting guesswork out there, and guesswork makes the enemy unstable and unreliable, and therefore the enemy won't attack you. But once you present the full-on case to the enemy, like, here's your enemy, here's all the information about the enemy, and you know what, you're stronger than the enemy, why don't you attack and grab everything from your enemy? And suddenly we get, Trump 100 times over, Putin 100 times over. So the question is, what do we do then? We don't know, because we're not even discussing what it means to conduct war in the era of AI. We're just opening the door, you and I here. So I'm interested in this because I can probably work specifically with the Swedish and the Nordic forces. With my team is to work with the military today to rediscover what it means to be a military warrior in the digital age, defending and even possibly extending a territory.
So if AI is able to produce an overview about costs that a war will produce for either side,
it would, if it had the data.
The possibility would be to have negotiations basically after everybody is presented with their potential costs, and so the potential victor can exert some financial or territorial gains, or
it would probably mean that the world would be left to America and China. They would conquer everything else, wouldn't it?
Right. Okay. So okay.
Yeah. So we don't want that. So what do you do then? Hey, what do you do if Trump raises tariffs, as he's trying to right now for America? Call each other. It's like, okay, so Canada and Mexico are going to have huge tariffs versus America. Well, why don't Canada and Mexico call each other and remove all the tariffs in between them? So the response is we must create new alliances to contain powers that are stronger than us, because otherwise we allow might is right to win again, historically.
Right.
This is deeply problematic. It's yeah. I mean, but if you're a peacemaker, if you're going to make peace, the best position you can be in is basically you present the case to the two sides of the conflict, that it's almost even between the two of you. Probably who's most willing to fight will win, but the cost to both of you will be enormous in any case. That's usually people put the weapons down.
I mean, it was not exactly what Francis Fukuyama said, but the idea, I don't know who floated that, I mean, there's America, there's China, there's Russia, and they kind of create an equilibrium of sorts, so there's no force that can be bigger than any one of the other forces. And so if there is that a stable enough system to prevent global war, or do we need an AI to?
There are no such equilibriums because economic growth is different to different parts of the world. Demographic growth or shrinkage, for that matter, different parts of the world. Populations go up and down in size. Economies go up and down in size. There is no such equilibrium. And what happens is that when the equilibrium isn't there, or when it's exposed for not being there, new alliances occur. Suddenly Russia calls Iran. Oops. And then you get new temporary equilibriums for a while until those alliances fall apart. And what you're doing when you're negotiating and you're putting up strategies, that you're basically saying, for example, Marco Rubio is probably sitting right now in America and thinking, okay, China is the main enemy. Could you move Russia over to our side? What would that require? Those are the kind of strategy games you do. I mean, if you read Henry Kissinger, you get this very, very quickly. But then you realize, well, that's been ever since Sun Tzu. That's been all of strategic history, or a wartime, or a history of war, has been war and strategy. And strategy is also how to avoid the conflict for as long as possible until you strike, and then you strike big, and then you win quickly and at minimum cost. And that's exactly what strategy is like.
Right.
So yeah, we have the pressure cookers. We also have a real war. We have real war between Ukraine and Russia. We have real war in the Middle East. We have real war possibly coming up in East Asia. China are not satisfied with Taiwan being independent in real life, and they seem to want to get hold of the island. And America and Japan can't make up their mind about it, what the cost will be to them, or whatever. And none of them knows, well, if I give in to the enemy, is that the end of the game? Will the enemy demand more? Well, probably. So we're back historically at a stage where war is back again, and we should just be really grateful that we until now haven't blown up the big bomb.
All right.
That's the way I see it.
I mean, the issue is that, we can talk about it on a personal level and say, okay, we have to integrate that, and but on a global scale, it's very complicated to find one strategy that alleviates us from war. And so AI, again, that could be a way, a medium, let's say, that everybody agrees upon.
Well, AI could also create the whole new weapons we never dreamed about that kill even more humans than ever. The hope is that AI creates drones that kill drones, but why would it stop there? So the problem is we don't know. We just know that the first question the military will ask AI, and the military will have access to AI before anybody else. And the first question the military will ask AI, how do I develop weapons so I can beat the enemy if there's a war? So yeah, sure. Just like I always advise people to go into the therapy industry, it's going to be bigger than ever. I advise people to go into the military industry, it's going to be bigger than ever, because, in every big, heavy, expensive weapon out there has to be replaced with an army of smaller, smarter weapons now. I mean, if the drones start killing the tanks are over historically, and that's a paradigm shift. It's just a paradigm shift in the weapons industry. We haven't seen digital warfare yet, but we will. We certainly will. And America and China are spending fortunes right now on beating the other guy in the game towards digital warfare, knowing that the digital war machine will beat the shit out of the industrial age war machine, which has its own problems with the feudalist war machine, which is currently the war between Russia and Ukraine. So it's all about paradigms in military history too. And in the middle of all this, we're sitting here as men with our libido, with our drive, and have to deal with it. And we do want to be novel, and we do want to be creative, and we do want to express something important to the world. But if all the world out there is offering to us is to go into even more consumerism and improve on products and services, then make people just consume more products and services, that's just an end game we don't want to be part of. And the only thing left then is either war or spirituality. And that's the game you and I are locked into, because obviously we're trying to get the guys over to spirituality, to masculine spirituality, to get them away from the urge towards war.
Right.
See if we can make it.
Yeah, well, the problem, of course, is, I was just reading up on Girard and the book Atsheva, Clausewitz, and Girard looks for Christianity as a way out of the extremization of extremes, as he calls it, the way of the spiral of violence. But he's very pessimistic that we're able to renounce violence via religion. And so that's, of course, a problem.
I think that's the problem with Christianity. And again, this is somebody who speaks for religion only on behalf of Christianity.
Right.
So strongly opposed to, me. I think it's a lot easier with Buddhism and it's a lot easier with Zoroastrianism. And my path is a Silk Road path. Why? Because the Silk Road path always had esotericism next to exotericism. To me, going towards an exoteric tradition
Right.
and moving into mysticism towards annihilation is an esoteric tradition. It's two ways of finding a goal for yourself to dissolve yourself and to meet death with grace. Two ways of doing it. I respect both. I just think one of them is a lot less violent and a lot less destructive to humanity than the other one.
But don't you need like a certain form of maturity to, in order to devote yourself to Buddhism and Zoroastrianism? I mean, it's like you can't expect 18-year-old boys who want to go to be that spiritual and that deep.
Well, you do with some. They're called monks, and they're best friends with soldiers.
Right. But that
So
wouldn't
I can
help
start
us.
by building from the monks.
Right.
And then there's a soldier monk in between. I met several guys who have this archetype. The Shaolin, China. And the soldier monk defends the monastery, defends the knowledge. So he's really defensive in the sense he defends the knowledge. And the great thing about the soldier monk is because he's defending not territory, but he's defending the knowledge. He's basically defending the library from being burned down. Because defending knowledge, he knows that if this library meets another library, none of them will go extinct. They'll become one huge library, which is the opposite of territory. Once you take somebody's territory, you take it from somebody else that you kill. So the great thing about information accumulation, which is what soldier monks are defending, is that it's deeply spiritual. So the soldier monk is somebody that I want to drag into the esoteric realm and say, here is, to start with, an archetype for a warrior who is not killing people, but is accumulating, gaining knowledge for all. But again, it's that damn question. What are we going to use this excess energy for?
Right.
How are we going to innovate with it? You know, I work very closely with Owen Cox on these things, and we do the Dark Renaissance. It has to be some kind of artistic expression, because we can't just improve on products and improve on services into a consumerist loophole constantly. There has to be something that we put our energy into that is sacred to us, but it's not productive in the sense that it leads to increased productivity. It's something else. And this is what attentionalism is all about, and this is what attentionalist art is all about. So these things that I'm talking about constantly in my work are orienting themselves towards this. It's also the next book we're dealing with, this in the Sufism book. We're dealing with art as an alternative expression to the regular sort of protopian creativity we expect from engineers.
Right. So last question. So taking all this, what we said, into account, from nomadology to the warrior to paradigm shifts, and so the problem, of course, is that we enter an age where the magnitude of possible war is global, and extinction level events are thinkable. And so, what is the way to think about war in all of this context? Like, how do we, I mean, nobody wants to fall in alarmism, right? But there is an inbuilt, you mentioned Mortido, there is an inbuilt drive towards destruction within us. And so what is the right way to frame war in that context?
It is to be prepared for the decision when the decision has been made. That's always the case in my philosophy. So, number one, the industrial age led all the way forward until we got industrial warfare, which was Hitler and Stalin, the concentration camp. It's the logical conclusion of the celebration of industrialism. And after that, modernity was dead. The Frankfurt School came along, and with Adorno's negative dialectics, we started going into post-modernity, and we started rethinking what modernity was until we basically dropped it and just realized it was one paradigm because digital came along. Well, I don't talk about modernism any longer because digital has nothing to do with modernism. It's an entirely new paradigm. The question then is, will we repeat the mistakes of the past? Will we allow digital to go all the way to its full potential to kill humans? We're very likely to. We don't have to. We're very likely to. The question is, what mechanisms can we put in place to put a brake on human beings from doing that, so that at least get to think twice or thrice about what they're doing before they make a decision? This is preparing yourself for the decision. This is what enlightenment is all about. We have a consciousness so that we can recycle the past and learn from the past, so that we're in the subconscious present and have to make decisions. We're pre-programmed, prepared to make the right decision. And in that case, I would ask anybody out there being part of this conversation, be prepared that when digital age violence pops up, don't jump on it like the fresh new thing, because it's just going to go back and hit you and kill your children too. So it's digital age violence we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about ourselves as violent human beings, undeniably so. And we're trying now to create new, larger pressure cookers and let the pressure out so we can contain it into something more productive. And it's a hell lot more fun to go and watch a soccer game between Brazil and Italy than to go into a battlefield in Papua and have somebody your own age killed. I can assure you of that. It is civilization's greatest advantage, right? So we could do the same thing now. And I think, can we contain the violence somewhere without it going too self-destructive? Which is hard. I mean, yeah, putting guys in front of laptops playing computer games that were terribly violent looking. We did that for 30 years, but the problem was that we killed their souls in the process too. So at the end of the day, is it any better to have your son killed in front of a fucking laptop playing computer games that ruin his soul than have him killed in a battlefield? Not really. So this is why Byung-Chul Han's questions are so relevant today. We have to ask these very questions. We cannot get rid of violence anymore. We can get rid of sexuality. These enormous forces have to be respected. They have to be understood. They have to be turned into artistic material. They have to be loved in a way. But we also have to respect them and contain them and create the proper containers for them where we can explore them, without letting them loose. Because right now we know, following from modernity 1945, we're in the atomic bomb age, and if we let the atomic bomb loose, we're done. So that's digital age violence for you. We thought it would be about the bomb. That was a comfortable solution. That was just one problem to solve. It was about millions of drones attacking us from everywhere now.
Right.
Isn't that the irony?
Okay, Alexander, I think that was fantastic. Thank you so much for stopping by. And
yeah, sure. Anytime, Tom, anytime.